Well, Diana, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name's Diana Giovinazzo. I am the author of Antoinette's Sister, right here behind me. It's my second novel. I have a bit of a ways to catch up with the 14 novels. Antoinette's Sister is a story of Maria Carolina Charlotte. She was the queen of the Two Sicilies. And as the name suggests, she was the older sister of Marie Antoinette.
Thank you, Diana. Sorry, I apologize about the technical difficulty there. Carrie was coming through just fine in our green room. Hopefully he can find a solution to that, but we'll press on. So I'm really interested in all of your journeys to how you all come from different backgrounds, and it seems like not all of you really started in historical fiction, or you kind of found your way there. So Sarah, the first question is for you. Can you tell us about how you came to, well, really you're rooted in World War II, and it's kind of a platform that you've created. So tell us about your journey, how you got there, and why you're consistently writing about World War II novels.
Oh, I have a very odd journey. I did not plan to be an author. I majored in chemistry in college and then became a pharmacist. I have a doctorate in pharmacy. And I thought I had my life planned out for me. I was going to work part-time when my kids were little, then go to full-time work as they got older. And then I had a story idea, and it would not leave me alone. And then another and another. And I had to write them. And so I got involved with writing. My first two novels were contemporary, and they were awful. And then I had an idea for a World War II novel, and I was a little bit put off by the research, but I thought, oh, that's okay. My grandparents lived during World War II. It wasn't that long ago. They told stories. How hard can it be? Well, of course, we're all snickering because we know how very much research goes into writing historical fiction, even to a more recent time as World War II. But by then, I fell in love with the research process. And the fun thing was my little scientific brain found that research fit my brain very nicely. So I really enjoy research thoroughly. And then I get to play in story world. So as I said, my grandparents were involved with World War II. My grandmother is on the home front, washing diapers without washing machines and hanging them to dry. My grandmother loved to tell that story. My grandfather was a medic in the Navy, a pharmacist's mate, and my great uncle was a B-17 bomber pilot. That's a huge story. But their stories drew me into the era, and then I fell in love with the era too. So lots of stories to tell there.
Yeah, I can see how your family history then kind of led you into that. Karen, I read that you didn't start writing historical fiction until 2014, and you have a very extensive background as a writer. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to historical fiction?
Sure. Well, as I said before, I've been an academic and I was working in universities for 25 years. But before that, I actually was in the army. And, what do I know? A weird sort of journey. I was an officer in the Australian Army and, a cartographer. So your journey can be very, very strange. And I think I initially wrote historical fantasy because, we have a few doctorates here. And as you know, when you write in that language, and, it's the publish or perish is the saying that we use in academia, you're writing in a particular style using a particular language. And I think that the imaginative part of my brain was being starved. So I'm an avid reader, like we all are, started writing, historical fantasy and loved it. And it wasn't till my agent, as a good agent should, one day tapped me and said, Karen, how about you leave the fantasy aside because you clearly love the history and just write historical fiction. So I had written before 2014, but yes, The Brewer's Tale, which is called The Lady Brewer of London in the USA and the UK, was my first full historical fiction. And I found I loved all the research and loved satisfying that, but then also crafting a story, or I like to say putting flesh on history's dry bones. So that's what I did. Yeah, so that was sort of my journey. And and because of illness, I had to semi-retire from academia, and now I write full time. So I feel very lucky that I can do that.
Yeah, I love that, putting flesh on history's dry bones. Carrie, let's go back to you. Let's see if we can get the audio to work this time.
Hello.
Perfect. Yeah, it's perfect. So Alf, and then also let's hear about your journey. You said you're an anthropologist. What led you to historical fiction?
Well, what drew me to this story, I wasn't drawn to historical fiction particularly. I wanted to tell a story about what happened in the West before I was born. And that required me doing a lot of research. And so this book took me actually 3 decades to write. And I just wanted to write fiction. But historical fiction allowed me to bring to life the events that interested me. And in anthropology, we do something called ethnohistory, which is the history of people from the point of view that you're studying. And so I was able to combine a little of that with this.
And I mean, did you enjoy it? You said it took you 30 years. What was that like for you, figuring out how to write historical fiction?
Well, there's an echo in my ear. I'm an applied anthropologist, and some of the things I do require me to go to court and testify on the part of Alaska Natives or others. And I didn't want a lawyer saying to me, "Oh, Dr. Feldman, is this a bit of your fiction or is this fact?" So I've held off on publishing. And after I retired in 2010, I was able to focus on it. And I've been writing this, doing the research. And I worked with a wonderful lady in California to bring it to life. So I had the story, but I needed to learn how to really bring the characters to life.
Well, great. I'm glad you stuck with that and brought us this book, Alice's Trading House. Diana, let's hear more about Trading Post, I'm sorry. Diana, why don't you tell us more about your journey? I know it came out of genealogy research, right?
Yeah, pretty much. For me, I started researching my family's background. My family came to the United States in the early 1900s from Calabria and Sicily. And so I really started to wonder what it was like, how they got here. That was the main question that I had initially was, well, how did they get here? And that question ended up morphing into, well, why did they come? What was going on in Italy that forced them to come to the United States? I'd always wanted to be a writer as long as I can remember. This was the childhood dream. Most kids dream about being rock stars. I was the kid with a notebook dreaming about being a writer. And of course, I guess naturally, I ended up in sociology, got a minor in anthropology, and then became a paralegal. So I kind of took this really roundabout route. And my father and I were in the kitchen one day discussing what was going on in Italy at the time. And he started talking about the Garibaldis. And he was like, you should really look into the Garibaldis. You would really like them, particularly Anita Garibaldi. And that was somebody I fell in love with her story and fell in love with the history of Italy, particularly unification and what went on with that. And after that, I realized that was all I wanted to do, was write historical fiction based on Italian history.
Diana, I want to stick with you just because you got that lovely poster of your book right behind you. So can you tell us more about Maria Antoinette's sister, who she was, how you discovered her, and why you decided to write about her?
So Maria Carolina Charlotte was such an amazing, fierce woman. She had, she was an archduchess. She was 3 years older than Marie Antoinette, but the two were raised as twins. So they were very close. And she found herself in this kingdom that was poorly run. There was corruption everywhere, things left undone. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, it's a kingdom that runs basically from roughly Naples down to what's known today as Sicily, that island. And so she had to really, you know, take hold of her role. And she started doing this really at a young age. She was like 18 when she really started to come into her own power. She was one of 3 women to actually stand up to Napoleon, which is a huge feat in and of itself. I came across the story. I was in the midst of doing edits for The Woman in Red, and my editor wanted more information on the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So I did what any writer would do and just become an expert within 24 hours. And when I was going through these stories of, excuse me, of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, these stories of Ferdinand started coming up. This guy who would rip the heads or the wigs off of people's heads. He was playing innkeeper, fishmonger. He was always out hunting, and he was this character beyond belief. And my first thought was, oh my God, who's the poor wife who had to be married to him? There had to be somebody who was stuck with this man. And that's when I discovered Maria Carolina Charlotte, and I just fell in love with her story, and and everything that she had to put up with and overcome just to be a queen in this time period where women had a little bit more leniency, but yet at the same time, she was still very much constrained by the patriarchy and social stuff during that time, for lack of a better word.
Definitely. And it's wonderful to hear how, you know, that moment when you discover a story like that and really can dive into it. I think that kind of segues well into Karen's book, The Good Wife of Bath. So Karen, can you enlighten us a little bit about who is the Good Wife of Bath and why did you decide to write about her?
Sure. Well, she features in Geoffrey Chaucer's the very famous, very long poem, The Canterbury Tales, which essentially tells the story of about 31 pilgrims wending their way from London to Canterbury in the 1300s, not long after what we now call the Black Plague. And in order to pass the time, they tell a story. They have to tell a story. And the idea is it's a competition, and the winner will get a prize at the end. And so they're meant to tell a story on the way there and then on the way back. But what a lot of people don't realise is Geoffrey Chaucer never finished the poem. So we only get them going in one direction. Now, there's a few women on the journey, but they're all religious women. So they're nuns or a prioress. And the wife of Bath is the only secular, ordinary woman. And she not only gets to tell a story, she gets a prologue to her story where she tells her own tale. And her own tale is amazing. She's very boastful and loud and very proud. And she tells how she was married at the age of 12. She's had 5 husbands. The first 3 were very old. And she basically is quite open about the fact that she manipulated them, she deceived them to get jewels and clothes. And she's essentially socially climbs with each marriage. Her 4th husband broke her heart. I think he was unfaithful and carried on affairs in front of her. And her 5th husband, who's the only husband named, his name was Janken. She met him at the funeral of the 4th husband, and she suffers. They have a dreadful relationship in many ways of domestic violence. He strikes her one day when she rips pages out of a book about wicked women. He's constantly telling her how terrible women are, and she gets tired of it. And he basically feels so bad because he thinks he kills her that we're told in the poem that they live happily ever after, or it's implied that things are fine from there on in. But we know it can't be, because she's on another pilgrimage, because she goes on all these pilgrimages, she tells us, to what we now call Israel and Cologne and Spain and all these places. But it can't be happily ever after, because presumably she's on this pilgrimage because she's on the search for another husband. So this story is given to us, told by a man. Chaucer tells us her story, and he represents her in a particularly very limited way. And people have interpreted it as very negative, as her representing all the worst traits of womanhood. Others have seen her, maybe he was being satiric and ironic, and she's actually a proto-feminist. And I think that lovely sort of tension between what was she and what how would she tell her own story, a real authentic lived life in those times with all those strictures and legal constraints and religious constraints? What would the life of a woman like that really be like? And what happens when she no longer gets married? How does she make a living? How does she have a voice and I guess a life, you know, and earn a living? So that's what I did with The Good Wife of Bath. And I'm just going to grab it. Hang on, I feel really... That's it. Is it back to front or is it just...
Oh, no, it's good. Yep. We can read it.
That's the book. Yeah. So I've only got one copy because things are so slow getting to Australia. But yeah, so there you go. That's essentially The Good Wife of Bath.
Well, I think it's a fascinating idea, you know, something to build off of, you know, what Chaucer wrote. And it must have been a lot of fun for you just using your imagination that way.
Well, I had great source material, and look, it was, and like everyone else here, did loads of research to, it's creative flesh on history's dry bones, is how I like to say it, to really make her a fully rounded, flawed, she's incredibly flawed character, and you know, she becomes educated, and she is still deceitful, but she's also loyal and kind. She's manipulative, but yeah, I loved doing it, and I loved plunging into the medieval world. It's funny, she actually appears, this character, in a book, in my first historical fiction. I loved The Wife of Bath for a long time, since I was a teenager, and I inserted her into The Lady Brewer of London. She appears halfway through, and she was only meant to be a very minor character, but as often happens, characters clutch you and they don't let you go, and they say, you write more. So she became another major character in that book, and I even say in the author's notes to that book, one day I'm going to go back and write her story. So she was very loosely based on The Wife of Bath there, and yeah, finally the time was right to go back and finally tell her story from birth to just before she appears in The Lady Brewer of London.
I think that's just great. Well, let's move to Sarah and talk. Let's let you talk a little bit about your characters. You have Lucy and Paul, and you know they're resistors during World War II. I'm curious. Well, first to know more about who your characters are, and you know, are they loosely based on real people, or how did you come up with those characters?
Yeah. Lucy Gerard and Paul Aubrey are both fictional characters. I wanted to write a story about the Americans who were living in Paris during World War II. And when I first heard that there were Americans still in Paris in World War II, I was stunned. I mean, Nazis coming, run, get out of there. We all think we would. And very interesting time period between June 1940, when France fell to the Nazis, to December 1941 with Pearl Harbor. America was neutral. American citizens were free to leave. And yet by the time of Pearl Harbor, there were still a couple thousand Americans still living in France, and they stayed for a variety of reasons. And of course, my novelist brain went, why? Why would they stay? And so I found a whole spectrum of reasons why they stayed. And two of them came out to me that really, I wrapped myself around them and wanted to tell their stories. The first one is the story of Sylvia Beach. She is the owner of Shakespeare and Company. It was a English language bookstore in Paris, huge center of a literary community in Paris for the expatriates in the 20s and 30s. Hemingway hung out there. She published James Joyce's Ulysses. Very interesting woman. She stayed. She was an American citizen. She was a single woman, and she stayed. And I thought, why? So I decided to create my own bookstore owner. I had to give her a little bit more of a reason to stay, other than, well, I just don't want to leave, because my readers would not accept that as a reason, because Nazis, run. So I decided that she loves this little English language bookstore called Greenleaf Books, and the owners are kind of foster parents to her. She's a ballerina with a Paris Opera Ballet. That's why she's in Paris. But when the Germans come, the owners want to leave because they're Jewish. But all their money is tied up in the store, and they need money for passage over to the United States. So Lucy impulsively buys the store so that they can leave. So that's why she stays. Now she can't leave. All her money is now wrapped up in the store, and she wants to keep the store open for her friends. The hero, Paul Aubrey, is an American businessman, and he represents those who stayed for financial reasons. there were a lot of American businessmen who stayed, kept their companies running. They were selling to the Germans, sold for $1. But I have Paul staying for a slightly different reason. He is still keeping his automobile company running, but at the request of the US Army, because they want him to sell trucks to the Germans and then send information from his German customers back to the United States. So he's kind of doing a little spying on the side. And they both get involved with the Resistance, Lucy's bookstore. She has the Resistance passes messages through the pages of her books. And so but when they meet each other, they don't really like, or he likes her, but she thinks he's awful because he's collaborating with the Germans. And I don't think I would have liked him very much either, not knowing what he was really doing. So it really tells the story of the Americans who really did live in Paris during the war. Really, really fascinated me. It was really fun fleshing it out, especially 1941, very interesting time period in France. The resistance was just starting to get going. They were trying to learn how to resist. This was a new concept. How do you pass messages without getting killed? How do you do all the things that they became famous for? They had to create that from scratch. So it was a really interesting time period to learn about and write about.
I can see that you're kind of brimming with energy just talking about it, and so it must have been a lot of fun for you doing that research. Carrie, let's ask you now to talk a little bit about your character in Alice's Trading Post. And I'm curious to know what led to your decision to write from the perspective of a Native American woman, and what were some of the challenges of doing that?
Okay. Well, thank you. I was reading this book I got from my dad about what happened in this battle that was 60 miles away from where I was born. And the first picture of me is on the Custer battlefield when I'm 1 year old. And everybody in Montana kind of knows this story. And I was angry with myself because I came to what happened to them after that battle, the Lakota and the Cheyenne. And I was angry with myself for not caring. And I decided I'm going to write a story that presents Native Americans as I've known them since I was in my teens. I played sports against the Great Crow Indians. You could Google Larry Prettyweasel. And they were like me, people. And one of the most disrespected human beings on this earth are indigenous people around the world. And I wanted to present them as people. And believe it or not, when I would get stuck, Karen, like, what am I going to do? I read the Canterbury Tales, because Chaucer did stuff in the 13th century, one of my favorite authors, that you couldn't do today. You know, oh, that's bad. I mean, you can't write that kind of stuff, like the gal that put her fanny out the window. And well, I loved it when I was in high school also. So Chaucer gave me permission to write. And I decided it had to be from the point of view of a woman, because as Native Americans would tell me, and the book is dedicated to Native American mothers, daughters, and grandmothers, we survived because of these women. And when you read these Westerns that my dad read, it's all about what these guys did. And they have shootouts. And I just wanted to tell a different kind of story. And I read 200 books and essays, and I was writing away. And one day, this is amazing to me, I was taking a shower and I heard this woman's voice. She was an old woman. And she said, "You don't know anything. Just listen to me." And I went downstairs and threw away. And this character started telling me who she was. And I let all these characters talk to me. And the history is there. You know, you're going to get you got a lot of history, but it's going to be through her friends and what happened to them as they were overwhelmed by this Western culture that believed the West, nobody lived there. It was a desert. And they were bringing kind of God's word and civilization to these people. She has wit. Alice is something like the Bath lady, but she's a lot kinder and nicer. She will charm your pants off. And she learns she has to lie. She's raised to be a boy, so she can fight better than most of these men. So there's a risk in doing that I'm not a woman. And that was the challenge. But my fiction mentor said, well, it can be done. And I went to my Native American friends and said, can I do this? And they said, yes, it just depends on how well you do it. So Alice, there she is.
Well, I love to hear that. And we definitely, well, and I guess just to hear that your story started out from way back when you were 1, that picture on the battlefield. But just to know that as authors, we all need help. We all need, it's more than just us sitting and writing. And for anyone who hasn't read Carrie's book, just the acknowledgments alone are worth picking up the book, because it's just such a wonderful acknowledgments, and you really go through all the people that you were able to trust in order to create your novel. Diana, let's go back to you. I'm interested in some of your research. Just reading the first few pages of your novel, you really get a sense for all the political factors at play. And Laura Morelli said that you managed to clear a path through a historical minefield. So was that difficult for you, and how did you do that?
Yeah, the politics, man. There were times where it was like really confusing. I had to break it down and go back and rework a lot of the history, just trying to figure out who was who, because on top of all of this political upheaval, there's the French Revolution, and then there's the American Revolution, and then you've got the War of Succession, which I think there's like maybe 2 of those. And then you've got some politics going on during Maria Theresa's age. So there was a lot of me just having to go through, kind of have a timeline for myself of what was going on in the world around Maria Carolina, and really try to focus in on what was going on for her, what was affecting the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and what was affecting her specifically. Otherwise, it could get too bogged down with everything going back. I mean, even there were some times where I had to go back and explain why the Kingdom of Two Sicilies was called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. I'm really thankful. One of the resources that I used for my research were the books, The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and also Sicily from, I want to say it was like 1519 to 1860. Both of those were written by a historian by the name of Lou Mendela. And so going through those books helped me get a sense of the history, and then also reaching out to Lou. So if I had any questions, Lou was there to answer those questions I had about that history and the timeline. But really, a lot of it was just trying to narrow everything down to what was affecting my character and the immediate world around her.
Yeah, and I think that you definitely accomplished that, and just thinking about the history of Europe around that time and everything that was going on with the revolutions, and I imagine that was both fun and challenging. Karen, so you already mentioned some of your research. Obviously, you're working off some fictional work, but what research went into your novel surrounding your character, the Good Wife of Bath?
Sure. Well, again, you're so indebted. It seems that it's a very solo activity writing, and it is, and you live in your head a lot. But you read so widely and broadly, and like Carrie, like Susan, like all of them, Diane too. I'm very grateful to other academics and historians who specialise in the era, journalists who also write about medieval times and stuff on, I guess, feminism, the Black Plague. So I was using medical books as well, and lots of really good academic articles, literary scholars who'd analysed the Canterbury Tales too. I was also fortunate pre-COVID because in the book too, she goes on pilgrimages. So I actually do take her to the places mentioned in the poem. And that was really fascinating. I've been to a lot of them. My mother's actually from Israel. So I traveled to Israel and Jerusalem, where the wife goes. I've been to Cologne, Rome. But I also read books on pilgrimages in medieval times and learned so much from that, because it was a way of, I guess, ordinary people without money or funds, to escape the strictures of their own lives. And for women particularly, have a bit of liberty. So whilst it was a spiritual religious thing, for many of them it was an adventure, and it was about exploring the world, but doing it, I guess, with social permission, you know, to move out of their own lives for a short time. Well, it wasn't short. I mean, they walked and used horses and boats, but ships rather. So the research was long. I spent about 2 years researching each of my books, but having said that, and Susan, you'd be the same, they overlap. So you're usually editing one from previously, you're finishing one, and you're already starting the research for another. And I'm a very silly person because I don't stick in one era. I've moved from the 1300s to the 1600s, then done the 1400s and the 1500s. And actually, look, this is a book I've just finished, and I'm editing before it goes. Can you see how, what be in the face? This is set in the latter part of Charles II's reign, the Restoration. So again, loads and loads of research. And I wish I could swing my Apple Mac around. I'm surrounded by books, all my research books. They're in here and in another room. So lots of reading, which I love doing. You go down a rabbit hole and it's so hard. Well, you don't want to climb out, do you guys? It's so much fun.
I must say it's definitely satisfying when you have the book at your fingertips, when you can just turn to your bookshelf, oh, I've got the source here, rather than having to go somewhere or look it up. You did bring up something that I want to ask Diana about, and Sarah, I'll go back to you in a minute here. I'm curious about travel research. Diana, did you go to any of the Habsburg palaces?
So, funny story. I've been to Naples, but when I started writing this, I started writing literally, no joke, 2 weeks before lockdown happened. So this book was very much my pandemic baby. I spent 2020 just in this office, in this room. I've got a big, we call it the dog bed, but it's one of those big like suede beanbag chairs that kind of doubles as a couch. I was there with my dogs and my research and my computer, just blocking everything else out and focusing on this book. So for me, Google Maps was a savior. I love that so much, especially with Caserta. And in the author's note, I do put in that she also spent time in Portici. But for the book, I kept her mostly at Caserta because, well, one, Caserta is absolutely gorgeous, and who wouldn't want to be there all the time? Two, I was able to go through Caserta with the little figure from Google Earth and just move about Caserta, giving myself my own private tour of the palace. And then online, you can see the blueprints for the palace. And so there was a lot of research that went into Caserta that I could find online, like even these the statues when they were, all of that. And that was just such a wealth of information for me. Hopefully this year I can finally make it back to Italy. You know, fingers crossed. We all put in those good vibes. I've had to cancel a trip to Italy twice now. So hopefully a third time will be the charm.
Yeah, so hopefully you can, but that is really wonderful that you can still visit virtually that way. Sarah, so I guess if you want to continue on this research, maybe you had a chance to do some travel research, but I'm also curious, in addition to that, I want to know more about some of the romance elements of your novel, and how you were able to tie romance and history together.
First of all, I'm a research junkie, and I've always loved visiting where my stories are set. There's something about being there and smelling the air and all the senses activated. like Diana, like all of you, I could not go this year. So this is my COVID baby also. Fortunately, I had been to Paris several times, so I was able to draw from those memories, if not the photographs, which have disappeared from some it was before we were digitizing everything. So those photos have disappeared, but I was able to draw on those memories and Google Maps. But I think also what was interesting for me, COVID related, was that this story, and I kept seeing these similarities because occupied Paris was not Paris as we know it. It was a place of fear and dread, and you couldn't trust the person next to you. You didn't know if they were going to turn you into the Gestapo. So there was a sense of social distancing, if you will, of masking. And so that how we're all walking around like, is she infected? I better keep my distance, especially early 2020. That sense of fear and dread that we all had just going out of our homes was similar to what they experienced in occupied Paris. So in some way, it really helped me write that novel. I was able to have a little bit of sympathy with what they were doing. As for romance, the love story is always what draws me to my novels. The history, and obviously I adore history. I do tons of research. My books are in the other room, but tons of them. I am dedicated to historical accuracy. I don't want to just write a story and fluff it up with pretty historical details. I want to really honor the people who lived through those time periods by getting the facts right, because people quote historical fiction. Well, I read in this novel and they quote it as fact. So I want to make sure I get my facts right so that my readers get their facts right. So I'm really dedicated to that. But the love story is really the heart of what I'm writing. That's what draws me to the story and really fuels my love for the story, because I want these two to find each other. And I think that offers an element of hope. I'm writing in a very dark era. There's a lot of death and destruction, but my readers especially are looking for hope. They're looking for, they want a happy ending. And so, and the reality is, in historical times, people found love. So I love writing about that. I love offering that bit of hope that even when times are hard, we can find something positive to latch onto.
Yeah, I definitely think that's one of the advantages of historical fiction is you can bring in those, those emotions, things like hope, fear, all the things that we experience that you're not going to experience just reading about dates and times. So I commend you for that. I'm going to bring Carrie back in here. We're up after I talk to Carrie, then we'll invite questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, make sure you post those in the Ask a Question there at the bottom. Carrie, I want to talk more about the voice you were able to create. And I think I saw a comment here in the chat. I'm reading Carrie's book now. He captured Alice's voice and the time so well. And you had a similar comment from Library Journal, and I'll just read it here. Feldman includes fascinating details about indigenous tribal customs, daily life, and history, recommended for readers of immersive historical fiction. So can you talk about how you were able to capture that voice?
I get echoes, so I take this off. Yeah, her voice is very interesting. Like I said, it came to me when I was taking a shower. I worked with a woman. I've got three sisters. I've been surrounded by women all my life. My mother was raised as a boy, and she's written novels. And I had this lady in California who actually worked with Louis L'Amour when he was first writing. And she would ask questions about everything. What does she feel? What does she think? What is this? What is that? Everything. And like Sarah said, what are the feelings? What are the senses? And anything that was me got taken out of there. I mean, Tony LaPopolo was my mentor, Southern California. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder how did I write it. It seemed like she wrote it. And I do have another version of this novel. I haven't told my publisher yet about it. And I don't even know it's legal. But it's a novel about how I wrote this novel. It's called Alice, Half Big and Me. And what I was going through at the time, and these characters would come and argue with me. I've got Gay Indian in there. That's her best buddy. And he's a two-spirit guy. And you don't find that in Westerns. And I have friends who are gay, Native friends. And I didn't want him in a novel, but that was her friend. And he was sweet on her husband. And it just came. And so Alice Halfbig and Me is another version of this. I don't know if I'll ever publish it, but it's based on what Pirandello did in his play, 6 Characters in Search of an Author. And I saw that when I was 24 in Harvard, and I said, damn, I want to do that someday, in which these characters say, you were thinking of me, you didn't finish the story, finish it. I mean, it's called The Theater of the Absurd, and I'm a great, I love theater, and I was in drama times. But my book is about these characters coming and arguing with me. They're my muses, and I don't want them. It's like, get out of here. And they win. They always win because I can't fool this old lady, this crazy old lady who knows what I'm thinking. And she teaches me stuff. And so it's a theater of the absurd kind of novel. And at the end, I tell her my grandfather on my father's side was a railroad man. She says, what? I told my story to a railroad man, the people that wrecked our life. I said, well, on my mother's side, my grandfather's a homesteader. What? She said, I told my story to a man whose parents dug holes in the earth that's sacred. I mean, farming is immoral to Lakota. You're digging holes in your mother earth. Then I have to, Alice's story is actually a love story. And I agree with Sarah. All my stories are love stories. I mean, if you write a story, it's not a love story. But her loves are very different. And I told about my grandfather and my grandmother meeting and how they fell in love. And at the end, she says, I like you. I'm glad I told you my story. Anyway, so I don't know if I answered your story, Colin. I'm trying. I don't know how I wrote it. She just came to me and wrote it, and I kind of miss her.
Well, she's there on the page if she doesn't visit you in the shower anytime soon. Well, I'm really enjoying this conversation. I've certainly got a lot more questions for all of you, and I wish we could keep going, for a while here. But let's look at the questions from the audience. So here I've got a question from Jana. It says, Diana, is Antoinette's sister a real person? And if so, how did you navigate truth and fiction? She continues, I'm writing about a real person too, whose story has not been told from her perspective. I consider her a bit of a victim of being on the losing side. And as we know, history is told by the victors. My greatest challenge is how to tell a story differently than history painted her about a real person. So Diana, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. For me, I wish I had a visual tool for it, because you've got the arc of how to do a story, then you've got the plot points or little points of history that kind of go along with it. So in my mind, it's matching up that bit of history along with your arc. But to speak on somebody who was often maligned in history, for me, I think my best advice on that is to try to find that one thing that you could connect with her on. There's something emotionally tying you to the story, clearly. As many of us, when we come across our characters in our stories, we're very connected with them. And find something within her story itself, within the history. I found when I was going through and researching her that history, that kind of brought out her character a lot. I was able to see letters and other bits of history that really talked about her personality and what historians said about her personality. And for me, on a personal level, I was really able to connect with her because, as I said, this was not only was this a pandemic baby for me, she was dealing with smallpox. And so there's this whole other pandemic that she had to deal with, and in the birth of vaccinations and inoculations. And when I was writing the book about maybe several months before I wrote the book, my best friend of over 20 years was diagnosed with cancer. And so I was here in this room, locked in my own kingdom, basically. And because of the pandemic, I couldn't be with her. I couldn't help her. And so in a lot of ways, I felt that separation that Charlotte felt with Antoinette, I was really able to pull into, because I could really feel what she was feeling at that time. And then when my best friend unfortunately died, that anger that went along with that grief that Charlotte experiences with France, that really spoke to me. So when you're writing about somebody, an actual person in history, finding those common threads really, really helps, in my opinion. And really, when we're talking about history, and especially people in the past, we're looking at that shared human experience. And that's one of the things I've learned with writing historical fiction, is that this shared human experience, that we're really not that much different from the people 50, 100, couple hundred years prior to us being around.
Yeah, definitely like what you said there about finding a common thread. We all see at least part of us, even in our characters. I think that kind of relates to a question that Sarah has for Sarah. She says, did your grandfather inspire you to be a pharmacist? Have you ever incorporated pharmacy into a story? So I guess that is an interesting question. Do you find yourself writing about pharmaceutical related topics in your novels?
I have had two pharmacist hero and a pharmacist heroine. My novel On Distant Shores has a U.S. Army pharmacist, and that was, I could go on about that for a while. I will not give you all the details. Very interesting situation with pharmacists in the U.S. Army at the time. And then I have another story who involved, Anchor in the Storm, with a female pharmacist who is trying to be accepted, running working in a drugstore in Boston. And this is a time when only 4% of pharmacists were female. And so a lot of the patients didn't want to have the girl druggist fill the prescription. Give me the real pharmacist. So she was overcoming a lot of problems in that story. And she undercovers a drug ring. So that was a lot of fun. But so I have been able to use my medical background. I keep getting my characters sick and injured. We all do that anyway, but I often find myself on these rabbit trails reading World War II medical textbooks when my character gets shot, like, all right, so what surgery are they going to do? And how long is his recovery going to be? And how are they going to treat that? And I do get probably overly involved in the medical aspects of my research, but it does fascinate me. So as for my grandfather, he was a pharmacist's mate, which was more of a medic. He was always very interested in the medical aspect of it, but actually it was a friend of mine from church who was a pharmacist. And she said, Sarah, I was a chemistry major and didn't know what I wanted to do with it. And she says, you need to look into pharmacy. And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, wow, this is fascinating. So yeah, interesting how we come about things.
And I kind of want to build off of that with Karen. Karen, did you find that you were telling some of your story in the story that you told about Eleanor?
Okay, can I just do something first? I owe Sarah an apology. I've been calling you Susan, and it's partly because you look so much like a friend of mine named Susan, and partly because I'm really nervous, and I'm so sorry. I'm really embarrassed. So Sarah,
I think my name should be Susan. I get called it all the time. I think because my last name is Sundin, and I see that and they get mixed up. So I respond to it.
Thank you. You're very generous. You do look like my friend Susan too. It threw me. Okay, sorry, what was the question? Oh, myself. Do I see myself? Was that it in my own life, in Eleanor, in The Wife of Bath? Oh, I wish I had her strength. I wish I had her sass. She and her ability to express her desires. But I will tell you a little bit of a personal story. My mother, who actually lived the last 15 years of her life in the USA, and I used to go there all the time to see her and loved it very much. She was married 8 times. And my father was actually her second husband. And what was interesting, I found growing up, is that, of course, and she was an Israeli immigrant in a country that still had a very strong White Australia policy. And so she really tried to fit in, and assimilation would probably be a more accurate word to describe how migrants were treated back then. So I watched my mother struggle, and you know, against this backdrop of revolving door of husbands. And I know I'm making light of it, but that's because it's easier to do in a very short time. But you can imagine it was very interesting for two young girls, my sister and I. And there was a lot of stigma attached to it, so we had to keep it a secret how many times our mother had been married. And what I found is kids can be cruel, and adults can sometimes be crueler. The stigma attached to our mother was also attached to my sister and I. What kind of girls were we? What kind of woman was she to be married so often, instead of seeing her strength that she didn't tolerate intolerable relationships? So I think somehow that must have lodged in my head. And I remember being mocked at university when I returned to university to do my PhD as a mature age student. And we had to tell something a bit interesting and a bit personal about ourselves. And I happened to mention as a throwaway that my mother was married 8 times, and I had just recently remarried my second husband, who I've now been married to for 29 years. But my the academic hosting the session said, "Oh, so I guess you take after your mother." And everyone laughed. And instead of being bold and brave and sassy like the wife of Bath, I just smiled, as women are trained to do, and took the insult. So I think if I'm not in her, my mum certainly is, my Emma. So, and in giving her a voice, I hope I've given every other woman who's been silenced and maligned unfairly and the chance to tell their mostly true story. And Diana, I'm really sorry for your loss too. I had a major loss as well, and I really empathise. So, yeah, I'm really sorry.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I'm going to wrap things up here. I do want to thank the panelists very much for joining us. This has been really insightful. It's really great to bring the historical fiction writers together, and we all go through that same craft and the same process. And it is, we do it a lot in solitude, but it's nice to talk about it. I want to thank everyone for attending. Obviously, we couldn't do this if we didn't have anyone attending, so thank you for that. Thank you also for bearing with us through some of the audio difficulties at the beginning. That's just the nature of these virtual events. If you do want to support these authors, please pick up their books. They're available for order or pre-order. You can click on that call to action button. If you can't afford the book right now, you can also just request it from your local libraries. If you can't do that, you can share, word of mouth, share on social media. These authors have put in a lot of work toward their craft, and they're not compensated as like they should be. I also want to thank everyone who did donate to History Through Fiction. We are an independent press without much funding, and just those small donations really help us bring these events to you. Because Crowdcast is not a free platform, so it really helps offset some of those costs. This is a panel that will continue to do, so we are actually planning another panel on March 14th, Monday, March 14th. We'll have 3 new authors coming to you for What's New in Historical Fiction. But before I end it here, I want to give the panelists the last word. So I'll ask each of you, what is valuable about historical fiction, and why do you write it? Carrie, why don't you start?
Okay. It brings to life an understanding of people, and it's not just a bunch of facts. And you get into their emotions, and it takes you out of and into yourself at the same time. So that's what it's done for me.
Thank you, Carrie. Diana, what would you say?
Okay, sorry about that. For me, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I feel that historical fiction really helps connect us to our past, to our ancestors, to who we were, and we can see how much we may have changed, how much we really haven't changed. And it really, I think, brings home that humanity that as a world we so needed to be reminded of.
Yeah, it's that how much we haven't changed that can be discouraging, but we have to keep learning in order to eventually change. Karen.
Yeah, I think everything Kerry and Diana said, and I loved your phrase before, Diana, of the shared humanity. It reminds us of that. And what you said too, Colin, I think that history and historical fiction is a way of accessing the past, and it's the best predicator of the future and the present. But as you said, we don't often learn from our mistakes, sadly. And I feel in some ways, you know, being an educator too, or having come from education, we're letting go of so much history. We're not teaching it. And I think that it's now falling to a great degree on historical fiction authors to tell it. And I love what you said, Sarah, about the facts. We've got to get the facts right. But of course, history has to serve the story, because ultimately we are storytellers.
Thank you, Karen. And Sarah, what would you say about the value of historical fiction?
Well, I think I love what you said about putting the flesh on the bones, because what I say is that when we're reading nonfiction, you see it. But when you read historical fiction, you become that character. You are in their point of view. You are feeling that fear. You're feeling the courage. And so it makes history come to life. It creates a love of history. And I really love that. I love getting reader mail saying, I read your book and now I'm reading about that time period because I'm so interested in it. So I love that. So I think it's really important for us because there's so many lessons, and every era we look at, there's so many important things about that era. And we like to think our time is the hardest it's ever been. And we like to think that, oh, no one's ever had it as hard as we do. And then you read about the past and you realize how very difficult things have been in the past, different kinds of different. And when you read about those people and you see how they endured and how they had strength and courage, that gives you strength and courage to get through what you're going through now. And it also gives you a really important piece of perspective.
Yeah, that's a wonderful reminder. I mean, this is not the first pandemic. I mean, we all think like we're the only ones who've had to deal with this. But yeah, historical fiction shows us that it's not, or history shows us that it's not. Well, thanks again to everyone. I really enjoyed this. This has been really insightful. And thanks for everyone for attending, and have a wonderful evening.